Good afternoon, everyone, to everyone joining us from Zoom. My name is Bennett Clifford. I'm the Senior Research Fellow at the Program on Extremism at George Washington University. We're excited to welcome you all to this event, the Global Internet Forum to Counterterrorism, Balancing Online Content Moderation and the Rule of Law. We'll have a very interesting discussion today with a truly top-rate cast of panelists. The Global Internet Forum to Counterterrorism is the world's largest NGO dedicated to cross-tech industry collaboration on countering online extremism. And we'll be talking today about how it's managing its simultaneous commitments to managing harmful content online, while at the same time upholding freedoms of expression and speech. A couple housekeeping notes before we begin. The first is about the structure of events. In a couple seconds, I will turn the floor over to Nicholas Rasmussen, who I'm sure you all know. He is the former director of the National Counter-terrorism Center, as well as the current executive director of the Global Internet Forum to Counterterrorism. After some opening remarks from Nicholas, we'll turn the floor over then to our three panelists, who will each give approximately 10-minute presentations. Our panelists represent a number of different perspectives. They all represent different groups with different stakeholders and different interests in the GIFCT's project. They are Audrey Alexander, a researcher and instructor at the Combating Terrorism Center at West Point, and my former colleague at the Program on Extremism. Dina Hussein, who's Facebook's Counterterrorism and Dangerous Organizations Policy Manager for Europe, the Middle East, and Africa. And finally, Evelyn Duick, who is a lecturer on law and an SJD candidate at Harvard Law School, as well as an affiliate at the Berkman Klein Center for Internet Society. After each of our panelists gives an approximately 10-minute presentation, we will open the floor up for comments and questions from the audience. Please use the Q&A tab at the bottom of Zoom and input your question. I will promise to answer or direct as many questions to our panelists as time permits. And we are looking forward to a fantastic discussion today about the GIFCT and its future. So without further ado, I will turn the floor over to Nicholas Rasmussen for some opening remarks.
Sure, thanks Bennett, and thanks to GW, POE, and the team there, a group of scholars and practitioners that I've admired for a long time, both during my government service and in the period after. Thanks to you and your colleagues for putting this event together to discuss GIFCT. You highlighted in your introduction that I'm the executive director. Well, that's been exactly true for about 7-8 weeks now. So an inaugural executive director also attaches to that title. And we can talk certainly about this during the course of the conversation, but there's been a pretty significant change in the way GIFCT is organized just in recent days, with my arrival as a full-time executive director and the standing up of the organization as a true NGO, a non-governmental organization. So I can certainly amplify on that when we talk with colleagues later in the session. But what I think is probably worth highlighting at the outset is why GIFCT is such a unique and interesting construct in the current environment. We've long dealt with challenging issues, be they of a national security character or some other character, challenging issues that cross different organizational lines, but I don't think anything crosses as many different organizational lines as do questions associated with harms on the internet or harms in the online environment, be they related to terrorism, violent extremism, or more broadly. And so that fact has brought into my life a term that I probably wouldn't have used much 5 or 10 years ago, but which seems to come out of my mouth almost every 30 seconds right now, and that is stakeholder. The word stakeholder comes out of my mouth almost every 5 minutes these days, because there is an endless array of stakeholders who are involved in the problem set that we're here to talk about today. That makes GIFCT a unique and interesting opportunity to provide a vehicle, a venue, a platform for stakeholder engagement on that set of problems in a way that really hasn't existed before. And I know Evelyn has written and spoken about this, the kind of way in which that might serve as a template for other work on other hard problems, where stakeholders have typically either shouted at each other from across different walls or bridges, but not actually sat around the table and worked on these problems together. And so when I think of GIFCT, I think of it as a huge opportunity to bring tech sector, government, civil society, academia, and even other stakeholders that don't fall neatly into those categories, but to bring all of those into the conversation, into the problem-solving mode when it comes to this particular problem set. And again, as I alluded, that has implications for other problem sets that we deal with, or that we as societies deal with. Speaking very narrowly and quickly about some GIFCT objectives during my early period as director, executive director, I would like to see GIFCT expand its membership to include a wider set of technological platforms and companies. As we all know, the founding members of GIFCT included some very big, large, successful platform companies, but by no means is the problem set restricted to their platforms. And so if we're going to think of GIFCT as being a useful contributor to solving the problem of online terrorism and violent extremism, there needs to be a wider set of companies and platforms involved in the work. Also ahead of us in the work in GIFCT for the coming year is some very difficult definitional issues that go to the question that I know Dina deals with quite often at Facebook, which is how do you define terrorism and violent extremism when you're not talking about something that is a prescribed UN entity. We can all agree on the virtue of removing ISIS videos and Al-Qaeda videos from all of the platforms that we worry about, but it gets considerably more complicated when you stray into new definitional lanes and try to develop an agreed taxonomy that we can all get our minds around. So that is a work ahead for GIFCT. Last thing I would say before turning over to this panel is that multi-stakeholder environment means you're not going to get it right on the first try every time. And certainly in a multi-stakeholder environment, there will be some at any moment who conclude that you aren't moving fast enough, that you're moving too fast, that you're handling the right set of issues, that you're not handling the wide enough or the narrow enough set of issues. And I am acutely aware of that. And to my mind, the only response to that is to focus on inclusiveness and transparency in the work so that at least that set of stakeholders, even if they don't like a particular outcome, can feel that they were part of the process and included in the conversation. And so that will be something I strive to make happen so long as I am running GIFCT. Lastly, GIFCT has been set up as an independent entity, and that's important. It's an important statement by the companies, but it falls upon me, it falls upon the companies to make sure that that continues to be true and that I speak with an independent voice when that opportunity presents itself, and that is my intention. If that involves being constructively critical, if that involves bringing attention to things that I think the companies are doing well or a company is doing well, it falls upon me to say that. It also falls upon me to say that if there are things left undone on our collective agenda dealing with extremism, violent extremism and terrorism, I need to say that too with equal clarity. So with that, Bennett, I'll turn back to you or actually flip over to Audrey, Dina, and Evelyn. I'm very anxious to listen and learn from them as well today. I'll stop there.
Should I just jump in, Bennett? Okay, perfect. Setting a timer, so I'm ready to rock. So first of all, thank you guys for having me. I'm really honored to be here in this digital room with people I really respect, and I'm excited to hear their comments as well. So thanks so much for this opportunity. Just for housekeeping, I want to begin by saying I'm the only one liable for my comments today. My views can only speak to me, but not represent the Combating Terrorism Center, West Point, or the Army. And then lastly, I've been spoiled over the past couple months, and I've gotten used to a 2-hour teaching time block. And today I only have 10 minutes. So please fasten your seatbelts because we've got a lot of ground to cover. So what I'm going to do is dive into sort of 4 different problem sets and 4 different areas that we can really focus on and build to. And I'll just begin with number 1. So first and foremost, any discussion on this, I want to keep rooted in how do terrorists and violent extremists exploit information and communications technologies? One of the things that scares me most is when our conversation about dealing with terrorist content online strays very far from realities of terrorist content online. Because it's so complicated and we need to be able to navigate that. So terrorists and violent extremists tend to be dynamic. They're opportunistic. They create very complex ecosystems. So if we just sort of think about some of the basics, they're using different file types, different types of tools to promote and share their content, even plugins. They have different objectives when they use these tools and behave differently across the map. So when you dig into content, not all content is equal or is problematic. Some is law-breaking, some is alarming or disturbing. But honestly, a lot of it is really laughable, unprofessional, strange, or downright mundane and really not interesting at all. And we have to realize that even though we are sort of alarmed by terrorist content, what that actually constitutes is really, really broad. So we will likely get into designations a bit today, and we've already talked about that a little bit. But one thing I would like to say too is, even for the sake of illustration, designations aren't necessarily our complete key to success here. So a lot of my research at the Program on Extremism and now at the Combating Terrorism Center has focused on the Islamic State, the group for which we have built a global coalition. We have a fair degree of consensus that these organizations should be denied a place online. But at the same time, as somebody who's spent a lot of time studying their content, and even more recently, I did a paper about how crowdfunding platforms were being used to basically raise money and direct money towards women in Al-Hol camp in northeastern Syria. So the way that they're using these tools is really complicated. It tends to be clandestine. And at the end of the day, some of that content doesn't necessarily meet a lot of working criteria for the promotion of terrorism, depending on all of these different definitions we use. So even though we can and should talk about designations, we also have to be very aware that just having designations will give us a better lexicon and better idea of what we're all working on, but it's not going to solve our problem altogether. So next, how can the reality of terrorist communications begin to inform our response? The short answer is that it really should. And as I said in the first set, one of the biggest things that concerns me is when we stray away from the realities of how these folks are using these tools. Because if we start providing policy solutions to what we believe is the problem instead of what is actually the problem, that's when we get in over our head and start developing solutions that we don't really need and that don't really work at trying to achieve what we're trying to achieve. So governments and, as we like to say, stakeholders should be really aggressive at trying to say what is our objective and how, what are the concrete and really more technical ways we need to go about achieving that objective. So in this case, the problem we're trying to address is really dynamic, resilient, adaptable behavior. We were talking a bit earlier about how the GIFCT hopes to expand its aperture for who's involved. And I think Tech Against Terrorism has also been an organization that's been good at bringing in new people, because we aren't just talking about messengers and file sharing platforms and social media, but also all of these other tools that either can be used for hiding IP addresses, which those organizations may not want to come to the table, and that's okay. Looking at just all of these different file types, whether even other forms of technologies like processors, basically. So moving down the line, we need to talk about the shape of an ecosystem and say that they're going to be companies of all sizes. So that says a lot about capability and how we can support capability. So the good thing is this is one place where we can already tell that we have been listening and identifying the scope of the problem, because we do have organizations that are trying to work together. So now and we got to talk about this a little bit before we broadcasted the conversation, is we can open up the aperture again for what that means for collaboration. Because collaboration doesn't just have to be centered around developing faster, smarter content removal tools. But there are so many different methods and tactics and partnerships we can start to encourage and develop to develop better ways to counter terrorist and violent extremist activity online. So whether that's content and certain behaviors, attack planning, just sort of broadening that. So just as we move forward, oh yes, this next point, I'm gonna say it this way because it's for the purpose of salience. Point number 3, how can we check ourselves before we wreck ourselves? This is really important, and I say it in a silly way because I think it's going to stick with us. We need to be very vigilant, again, about trying to solve problems as they are instead of how we envision them. Because especially when we look at terrorist content online, it's spooky and it's ominous, and it's going to cause violent extremism and all of these really dangerous threats. But really, there is not in the literature a compelling relationship where terrorist content causes activity. It's really cyclical to my understanding of it, because sometimes terrorist content features activity and sometimes terrorist content may inspire terrorist activity. It's really not as simple as we think. So if we are basing a lot of policies on the belief that terrorist content leads to mobilization, then I think we're operating in sort of an environment that hasn't been fully built out. So what we need to do is start thinking of ways we can recalibrate our instruments and use them to marginalize and mitigate these threats and reduce these threats. Because at the end of the day, terrorist content is always going to be online unless we don't have an online space. There will always be something. And what we need to do is sort of change our posture to be ready and resilient and adaptable in the face of challenges as they arise, instead of worried and preoccupied about shutting them down altogether. Because this is going to really change how we work with each other, how we work with different companies, and how we can improve our capabilities. So I guess it's a couple years ago now, but Bill Braniff and I worked on a paper about marginalizing violent extremism online. And this idea of marginalization can really come in different forms, but the thesis here is that we can develop policies to try and sideline, try to mitigate the influence, drown out these voices, and ultimately keep them on the margins. If a lot of these groups are fringe groups to begin with, the point here is really there are going to be people always on the fringe. So how do we make sure that a lot of these ideas are not necessarily mainstreamed, buttressed, or allowed to grow out of in genuine inflation, if that makes sense. So ultimately, the marginalization paradigm relies on a range of actors, or as we are saying, stakeholders, to work together sort of under this shared idea that our goal is not to completely stamp out these actors, but rather just sort of take proportional and pragmatic steps to keep them at bay and keep them right size. So next, and sort of our fourth and final point, is talking about how we can situate the GIFCT and strive for proportional and pragmatic means to marginalize violent extremists online. So I believe Evelyn will speak to this a little bit today, but we're at a point right now where the GIFCT could set a really interesting precedent and foundation for other ways we deal with online threats. And that's an important role to fill. And I think that, to my knowledge, the GIFCT is very aware that it carries this weight in the community, in the internet community, as well as in the counterterrorism community, and dealing with other crimes and threats. So even though it's sort of a strange way to think about it, I really encourage us to be uncomfortable and unsettled with all of our differences of opinion, because this really does, at the end of the day, need to be a democratic process. It's okay that we don't all agree on every single line, because we should encourage companies to do things differently. We should encourage companies to work from different lists and enforce different views, because that's actually going to allow this marginalization paradigm to become, or to be implemented. So in many ways, and this could be a terrible parallel, but at the same time, I think it does make sense. We have to kind of think of the GIFCT as a mini United Nations, because what it's going to do with all of these companies that have very different size, capability, different infrastructure, different challenges, it gives them sort of a banner and a toolkit to identify standards, identify what norms we would like to work with, and sort of set a criteria over which everybody else can operate. And it doesn't necessarily mean it's going to be the fastest or the most efficient solution, but it's a way that people can convene and start working through some of these tough problems, finding consensus when we can, and working together to progressively make the world safer and more functional place where people can still operate and speak freely and free expression. So yeah, great. Well, thank you so much. I'm going to hand it on over because my time is up.
Before I turn the floor over to Dina, I just wanted to say to our audience, in case you missed the opening remarks, that if you have any questions for our panelists, please use the Q&A tab at the bottom of Zoom. You'll send them in and we'll answer as many as we can at the end of the presentations as time permits. Sorry for that quick interruption. I turn the floor over now to Dina Hussein from Facebook.
Thanks, Bennett. As with Audrey, I've got my timer going, so you won't have to listen to me drone on for too long. First off, I want to thank Bennett and the George Washington University Program on Extremism. They're a partner for GIFCT through our research consortium, but they're also a partner to Facebook through all of the different work and stakeholder engagement that we do in working on our counterterrorism and dangerous orgs policy. And with that, you may have heard from Bennett that at the beginning of this call, when he introduced very kindly all the speakers, that I am part of Facebook's Counterterrorism and Dangerous Organizations policy team. Many of you are probably asking yourself, why are we listening to a Facebook person discuss GIFCT? That is because, to Nick's point, up until he came in to become our executive director, and I could not be more happy that we were joined by Nick, the different companies were chair for a year. So for a year, Facebook was the chair of the GIFCT, effectively monitoring all the different work streams and helping support all of the smaller companies. So in looking at GIFCT from the tech company perspective, we really are looking at GIFCT as a stakeholder and multi-industry forum for collaboration. When it was formed in 2017, it was made up by ourselves at Facebook, our colleagues at Twitter, at Microsoft, and at YouTube. And the goal there was to look at the presenting abuse types when it came to the field of terrorism, and see where we could share best processes, lessons learned, and discuss where the baseline of our actions could be supported by one another, and then looking out to the smaller platforms that are also dealing with the same threat. Having looked at the way that this abuse was manifesting on our platform, we had all noticed conjointly that all of these smaller platforms were a off-ramping vehicle for a lot of this abusive behavior. So we would see that in chat rooms, there were indicators that, hey, we're going to take this off to Telegram, or we're going to take this off to VK. And that started everybody thinking about, how do we not just support the larger companies with the large infrastructure and resourcing around this kind of work, but the smaller individual out of the basement of your mom's home kind of startups. So with that, when we were looking at the structure of GIFCT, we really did want to build out pillars of work that would support both other tech companies at our scale, but most importantly, smaller tech companies. And we came up with initially 3 main pillars of work. Those centered around joint tech innovation. They also included knowledge sharing, and most importantly, from my perspective as a former researcher, but it differs from one company to another, but most importantly to me, conducting and funding research and partnering up with the experts in the field, such as GW, such as other consortium members in GNet, who would be able to arm both GIFCT and other tech companies with the knowledge and the understanding of baseline trends, so we could accurately and aptly address this abuse on the platform. So when we're looking at those 3 different work streams, we're really looking at a breakdown of tools. The first, joint tech innovation pillar, looks at sharing tooling and sharing knowledge from a programming perspective. When it comes to that, we're really discussing our hash sharing database. And I know that Evelyn is going to touch on that. And I know we discussed this with Nick and a lot of you on the call. But for a baseline, for those of you who aren't in these consistent conversations with us, the hash sharing database is a database that is hosted to gather the digital fingerprint of images and videos. And to be very clear for those of you who might not know, the hash sharing database is a collection of digital fingerprints that are made up of a numeric value. That numeric value cannot be reverse engineered. You don't walk into a room of dangerous content if you are accessing the database. It's really just an ability to go into, utilize freely available software. So part of the work stream that GIFCT works on is to provide freely available software to image and video match. Once you have that software, which you can find now available on GitHub, you're able to access the database, which, as we mentioned, is a digital fingerprint that's not really reverse engineerable, but you can plug that digital numeric code into the program, and you can find matches on your own platform. What you then decide to do with the matches that you find is completely up to you as a platform. There's a little bit more information that usually at this point we want to emphasize and share. Any content that is in the hash sharing database is not haphazardly put there because the tech companies just decide that this is something we want to add to the hash sharing database. It is part and parcel of content that is identified and known to be associated with organizations on the UN Security Council's consolidated sanctions list. So as part and parcel of that, obviously, we are aware that there are very many political there's a lot of political discourse about designation lists, and to Audrey's previous point, it was a very difficult conversation to come to the table to have a very baseline understanding of what kind of terrorism are we addressing. So, and again, I know that Evelyn and I have had multiple conversations around what the benefits and drawbacks are from using designations lists. But for a baseline, for multiple companies to be able to come to the table, and for small companies to be willing to come to the table, we decided that that was the baseline we were going with. So some statistics. To date, we have shared, those of you who are following us, to date we have shared all of the numbers around our hash sharing database, as well as all of the different additional frames of work that we're conducting. But if you want to follow on very closely, you can access all of the information transparently on GIFCT's website. That includes a breakdown of the hash sharing consortium, all of its content. You may or may not know that over the last couple of years, we've shared over 300,000 hashes in the database. And again, I direct all of you that want to know a little more about the breakdown to the GIFCT website, which is gifct.org. Moving along, in addition to the hash sharing database, we also share URLs. So we have identified certain URLs with a packaging of abusive indicators around them. Let's say we know that a member that is representing themselves as a member of ISIS in chats or messenger chats are indicating that this is a Telegram chat you should go to, then we would send that if it's a Telegram chat, and if it's something that we know is tied to a company that is part of the GIFCT. So let's say it's a Dropbox chat, or it's a Dropbox file, apologies, or it potentially is a link to WhatsApp chat, we can send that directly to the company that it is relevant to. Again, all of the information around that is publicly available, but I can also share that over the last few years, we've shared 24,000 URLs with the relevant companies. So that's just an overview of the tooling. I want to jump over to the knowledge sharing because I think that's important for a lot of people on the call. One of the main goals of GIFCT is not just sharing the tooling, but sharing the understanding around this abuse type. We like to mention that in a lot of situations, when you are joining a GIFCT call, you're usually a policy member. And for the smaller tech companies, when you're hiring your 100th hire, it's almost inevitable that hire will be an engineer. If it happens that hire is a policy person, I can guarantee you they're not going to be a counter-terrorism expert that spent the majority of their life studying radicalization in Northern Sinai. It's a rarity. I didn't think I'd be doing it for a tech company, so it's a surprise to me as well. But when that is the circumstance, then you want to be able, as a larger tech company, to share that knowledge. And it's not just the knowledge in-house, it's the knowledge that you're getting from all of your partners and experts in the field. So to that end, we have funded a research institute over the entirety of the existence of GIFCT. In phase 1, it was the Royal United Services Institute, who came out with 13 excellent papers, again, all of which are available on the GIFCT website. And this year, we're really proud to have partnered up with the Global Network on Extremism and Technology, which is the academic research initiative funded by GIFCT, but is independent and, while industry funded, is run out of the King's College in London and through the International Center for the Study of Radicalization. So I think Charlie and Shiraz are on the call, and I'll do a shout out to them for that. As part and parcel of that, we're looking at geographic diversity as well, because as we know, and as we've discussed more recently on a few GIFCT webinars that Nick has joined me on, there is a variation in the way that violent extremism manifests regionally. And we would be remiss if we didn't acknowledge it and include that in our work streams. So we've got representation from GW's Program on Extremism, the Peace Research Institute in Frankfurt, the Center for Excellence in National Security at RSIS in Singapore, as well as the Lowy Institute in Australia. So that covers the research portion of our work. We've covered the knowledge sharing we haven't covered the knowledge sharing. We've covered tech innovation. We've covered conducting and funding research. But finally, I want to cover knowledge sharing in the content incident protocol. For our knowledge sharing, we partner up with a wonderful partner, Tech Against Terrorism, who are a UN CTED mandated NGO. The UN Counter-terrorism Executive Directorate put together a partner in Tech Against Terrorism for us to work with as private entities. And they've been our partner on the ground with all of the different workshops that we've conducted across the world. To date, we've conducted workshops in over 15 countries. We've reached out to 40 NGOs plus. We've partnered up with 16 governments. We've partnered up with 140 tech companies. And we're adding to this as we move forward, albeit virtually over the next year, most likely. So that's the knowledge sharing portion of our work. And I really do want to give a huge shout out to our Tech Against Terrorism partners. Adam Hadley, I know, has spoken with GWPOE on multiple occasions, and they're a really excellent partner on the ground. And then finally, one of the things that I know is of interest, but because I don't have that much time, I'm happy to take as much of this offline as possible. But we've put together what we call a content incident protocol. And it's the process by which GIFCT member companies can become aware of and quickly assess any potential content that is manifesting online as a result of a real world terrorist incident. That allows us to activate the companies in the consortium, and it allows us to upload content that is either perpetrator or accomplice created that we've identified on the platforms and share it for ease of access and quick response time by the tech companies. Again, that is the one situation where we are not going by the UN's consolidated sanctions list. And I know that is something that we really want to work on and advance, but it's one of the factors that allows us as tech companies as a whole to respond quickly to real world events. We share the numerics around all the kinds of content that we've added to the hash sharing database, and each of these incidents gets its own tag, as we refer to it, in the database, which allows tech companies to select it, understand what's in it, and really allows them to fine-tune their approaches and their searches for this content. So I've thrown a lot at you when it comes to the GIFCT's work, but it's an overview, and it's an overview of a snapshot that we have now. But I really do want to highlight, and I know I'm over time, Bennett, please forgive me, but I want to highlight that with Nick joining us and with the GIFCT becoming an independent NGO, it shifts the dynamic a little. What we were not able to do as tech companies telling other tech companies what, you never want to be Facebook with all its resources telling other tech companies what to do. It allows us now to hand over to an independent body that then is capable of making more of these decisions, allowing for more transparency on their side, and partnering with people like Evelyn and like Audrey to allow more access to the work streams, more input there, in a way that is independent from the tech companies themselves. Thanks so much for the time, and I'll hand it over to Evelyn.
Awesome, thank you very much. I use slides as a crutch, so I'm gonna just chuck some of these up now. Everyone, can you see that? All good? Perfect. So I just want to put my cards on the table right up front and say I'm not a counterterrorism researcher or expert, and so you may think, what am I doing on this call or this panel? I focus on platform governance more broadly, and sort of how we legitimate the very important decisions that social media companies make around what is available for us online. And so I am thinking about the GIFCT in that capacity, and I think it's really important. I've sort of said that I consider this to be one of the most important projects for the future of online free expression. And that's not only because of what it is in itself, which I do consider to be extremely important. It's extremely intrinsically important. But as Nick said at the beginning, I think that it's very likely that this will become a model for how we sort of think about content issues in a whole range of content areas. And so I think it's really important that we get it right. And I think that because we are seeing it happen already. So the GIFCT is an example of something that I have called in my work a content cartel, which I like to joke is obviously not fully intended to be a compliment. It's what I mean by that is it's an arrangement between platforms and governments to work together to remove content or actors from their services without adequate transparency or oversight. So I am really going to focus on that last bit in my presentation today, namely because we've heard the good use case for it from a lot of people today, and so that's what I'm going to focus on. I just want to sort of point out, so the model for this kind of arrangement actually started in the context of child sexual abuse material, where they had a very similar arrangement, and they still do, of a shared database of hashes, which then platforms use to match uploads to their services against and control the spread of that, which was used in the model of terrorist content and brings us to the GIFCT today. Already in that step, we are introducing a number of ambiguities and problems that make the model slightly more concerning. So the child sexual abuse material is a much more easily definable category of content than terrorist content. As Audrey was speaking about before, it's really hard to define what terrorist content is, and we've been talking a lot about the designation lists and things like that as well. But also a lot of it might not necessarily be problematic, and also it comes in different contexts where it might not be concerning. So for example, legitimate reporting on terrorism or research and that kind of thing. By contrast, child sexual abuse material, we can pretty much, there's almost universal agreement that that's never acceptable in any context. You don't want to see that on a news report. You don't want to see it anywhere. So that makes it very different. We are then seeing sort of the success of these kinds of models being talked about as a reason to expand collaboration in areas like coordinated inauthentic behavior, or things like election interference. And I think that, you know, and you also hear it invoked in a whole range of contexts, for example, things like deepfakes, things like hate speech. Jigsaw is a part of Google that has an algorithm that it uses to identify hate speech that it can lend to other social media platforms. And just sort of more generally, this idea that platforms should come together to identify problematic content and remove it from their services. And in each step of those chains, we are getting more and more ambiguous and more of those concerns that we were talking about the category of content being harder to identify. Why do we like these? Why do we like these arrangements? A number of good reasons, which the panelists have mentioned already. And I am very sympathetic to these arguments. I do really think that there is a good use case for this kind of collaboration. Competition is not going to fix all of our problems with harmful content online. What's more, if we impose really rigorous and stringent standards for platforms to remove content, that can in itself become a barrier to entry and reduce the kind of competition that we want to see. Furthermore, bad actors don't think about the internet as a platform by platform affair. They think about it as an internet as a whole ecosystem, and they are using cross platforms to sort of augment their activity. And so it makes sense to also in response work together. It's possible that this could be a more speech protective model because it allows the use of more nuanced tools developed by better resourced platforms that can then, instead of using a blunt force, like for example, we're going to block all content in Arabic, which sometimes smaller platforms feel like there's too much terrorist content, we can't deal with this, we don't know how to moderate it, we'll block all Arabic content to ensure that we don't have terrorist content. Instead, they can take advantage of the technology of bigger platforms. And more broadly, just this idea that it's part of a sort of corporate responsibility and social responsibility to not just sort of fix up Facebook, for example, and say, well, we've dealt with our terrorist content, good luck to the rest of you. More broadly, let's think about this as a society-wide problem. Here are my concerns. So first, we have a lot of concerns about content moderation in general. Where I spend a lot of time talking about transparency and accountability deficits within individual platforms. We don't have adequate appeals. We don't have adequate transparency around how effectively rules are enforced, things like that. These collaborations can tend to compound that for a number of reasons. For example, when a piece of content gets added to the hash database, we don't actually know which platform added it. And that kind of thing. And so it's hard to identify and hold the decision maker to account if we can't even identify the decision maker. Along with that compounded accountability deficit, it kind of gives the whole thing a bit of a patina of legitimacy. You might, think of this as a kind of blue washing or greenwashing in the context of the UN or environmental initiatives, where we point to the GIFCT as a thing that platforms are doing, which is really good, and it is in some ways. But if we don't fix those problems and those accountability deficits, that can be an unearned dividend. So we talked a lot about how this helps smaller platforms, and that's definitely true. And Dina said, technology companies don't like to be in the position of telling what other technology companies to do, but we do have experience where it can be difficult for a smaller platform in these kinds of arrangements to really exercise a substantial amount of power against the decision-making power of these mega platforms. And so it can, in a sense, augment the power of those bigger platforms who realistically are going to be the people that are adding the most content to the database, identifying it, funding the most research, that kind of thing. And so we want to have some sort of checks and accountability in place to make sure that they are not just augmenting those kinds of decisions and any biases that are inherent in those decisions across the entire collaboration and to smaller platforms who might feel like they're in a situation of take it or leave it. And finally, more broadly, just sort of when we think about speech, we think about the idea that we might want competing understandings of what should and should not be online and work it out in a marketplace of ideas. Now, the marketplace of ideas analogy is hopelessly flawed and doesn't really sort of apply. And so I do want to absolutely acknowledge that up front. But it can sort of, this kind of arrangement could suggest some sort of like, we've all come to a society-wide agreement of what is or what should or shouldn't be online, because that's what we see on most of our platforms. But in actual fact, again, it might be as the result of a decision by only a few key actors within that, that arrangement. And in particular, and I don't know if we've talked about this a lot yet, but when there are governments involved in these arrangements, that can be particularly concerning. So, the sort of one of the fundamental assumptions around free speech theory is that that's where distrust of government decision-making is at its highest, because they have their own interests at stake. And so when there are governments involved in these arrangements, that can be particularly concerning. There's a thing called the Baader-Meinhof phenomenon, which is when you learn about something, you suddenly start to see it everywhere. This has been my experience with content cartels. I sort of identified this thing, and now I'm sort of seeing it. We talk about it in the context of election interference. We talk about it in the context of COVID-19. And talk about it in the context of image image misinformation in the context of COVID-19. And this is a bill that's been introduced into Congress, which is also talking about it just more broadly, the idea of platforms sharing technology and information in content moderation. So I really do believe that this is something that can really shape how we think about content moderation more broadly, which is why I am so invested in making sure that this kind of process goes well, and that in particular the transition to the independent organization that Nick is helming it gets a lot of the key decisions right. And I think we're really only at the very beginning of working out what that looks like, and we have a lot of really huge open questions that we just don't have answers to. We don't know what proper transparency looks like, or what kind of meaningful oversight we need, or how to make sure that if we have a centralized decision-making point, we also have some sort of centralized remediation. Because at the moment, if a kind of decision gets made in the database and then has its effect across a whole range of platforms, at the moment, the people affected by those decisions have to go to each individual platform to try and challenge that decision. And that obviously has an imbalance. I know that I'm over time, but I just want to say that I think that we are at the beginning of answering these questions, but the only thing that we do know for sure is we haven't got it right yet. I don't think there's adequate transparency. I don't think that there's meaningful oversight, and nor are there adequate sort of procedural safeguards and mechanisms for the way in which, in particular, the database is used. And there is the transparency report that was mentioned earlier on the website, but I think that there's a lot of work that needs to be done there. It's really not clear sort of what kind of content is in there, which platforms added it, how many times the decision making with respect to that content was appealed or was considered a mistake. Those kinds of things is just not there, and really should be available for independent researchers to assess. So that's my doom and gloom assessment. I do believe in the promise of something like this, and I really think it is important and could be a really valuable innovation. But I think we all know that there's a lot of work to be done to make it so. Thank you very much, and I look forward to your questions.
Excellent. Those were 4 excellent presentations, and I think one of the things we can really draw out of that is the scope and the number of issues that this very ambitious project will have to face during the next couple of years, both from the perspective of what they've gotten right, and then also in terms of some open questions that are left to be answered. What you love to see as a moderator are all these great questions that have been submitted for us. We have about 10 minutes, so unfortunately I don't know if we'll have time to answer them all, but we'll take a crack at a couple questions that I think it would be important for the panelists to address in this discussion. There's one question here about whether individuals or groups have used any of the platforms and techniques to rework them and apply them to rehabilitation efforts. I'm actually going to take my moderator's privilege and amend this question a little bit for all the panelists. While they're, I guess, somewhat out of vogue, a couple of years ago, a number of the GIFCT partners were engaged in efforts towards counter speech. That is not just removing harmful content or moderating it, but putting their own type of content in effect to counter it. My interest is, what is the protocol for GIFCT if an individual platform decides to take these counter speech actions? And my other question is from both sides, from both the perspective of the platforms involved, and then Evelyn, I'd like to get your perspective on this. What precedent does it set if there is a GIFCT procedure for counter speech as opposed to just content moderation or content removal?
I'll jump in to start and ask Dina to come in behind me, since Facebook is dealing with this probably in real time. I think short answer is yes. There are certainly counter-narrative efforts underway on each of the primary platforms that fall under the GIFCT rubric. And my view, that's a good thing. You want these platforms to be used to bring counter arguments to bear that would hopefully persuade an individual who might be headed down an extremist or violent path to adopt a different view. That said, that brings into play some of the very concerns Evelyn raised, which is complexity when it comes to content moderation. You know, again, the quintessential example of a dash flag being used as an iconic image to attract a potential adherent or recruit. And at the same time, that dash flag might be appearing in some counter narrative postings that would be seeking to send exactly 180 degrees opposite message. Well, obviously, if human eyes were looking at every single piece of content in real time at all times, that be it possible to discern the difference between that content. It might not be as possible to do that when you are relying on, just for lack of a better word, technology to help flag where content is of the sort that needs to be removed. And so the very thing that is a good thing, counter-narrative work being done on these platforms, also add to the complexity of content moderation. That does not, in my view, take platforms off the hook for trying to find ways to make that discerning judgment in something like a timely way. Dina, you've dealt with this more directly at Facebook for sure.
Thanks, Nick, and thanks, Bennett. It's a very interesting question, mainly because we, to a certain extent, started tackling it, and we've selected individual ways to do it as platforms, but we did jointly do one thing with the GIFCT that touches on this. So last year, the GIFCT put out something we refer to as the Counter-Narrative Toolkit. And that was a toolkit that was actually not created by the GIFCT. It was created by our partners at the Institute for Strategic Dialogue, who are, again, an excellent stakeholder, to Nick's point. And that enabled us to then create effectively a menu of tools from each of our select companies. Facebook handed over all of the different counter speech and counter narrative resources that we have, including how you optimize for your audience, how you create a group, how you look at the kind of content you're putting up. Our partners at YouTube did the same thing. Our partners at Twitter did the same thing, and so did our partners at Microsoft. So we created our own collection of tools that we were able to provide through ISD's toolkit to activists who are trying to create this counter narrative. But again, this was a tool that was then handed over to our NGO and CSO partners, and we do a lot of workshops, as I mentioned. So whenever we discuss this with, so we were in the Middle East quite a few times because I'm from the region, and we were able to connect with CSOs there, and we arm them with the tools that are already available, but we do not dictate what you use it for. And I think that's a really good flag, because again, we face that same conversation of where is it appropriate for tech companies to be telling other tech companies what to do when it comes to the terrorism field? But can you imagine when we go beyond that to counter narratives and counter speech, that's a very, very touchy area. Again, with Nick and the GIFCT taking its own independent flow, I think that is something that he will tackle, and as part of his work with the GIFCT, if he'd like to partner up with other NGOs to look at this kind of work that the GIFCT can do independently, that's an option. But I do want to separate arming CSOs, activists, and experts with tools is one thing. Dictating what kind of content they're putting up on platforms is a vastly different thing. Now at Facebook, we do have we do have programs. So whether you like to refer to them as counter speech or counter narrative or CV or PV, whatever is du jour, we do have programming that we utilize within this field. For Facebook, for example, we have something called the redirect method, which those of you who are familiar with their field, yes, we did somewhat borrow that from our YouTube partners through the same implementing partners, but we utilize a specific list of terms that are collated by experts in the field and our NGO partners. And if you are searching for this content, which we know is harmful, and I'm not just talking about a Heil Hitler, I'm talking about 1488. That's an in-group, in-term. If you know what I'm talking about, you know what I'm talking about. You're looking for so the 14 words of white supremacy, 88 Heil Hitler. So you're looking at in-group and dog whistling terms that are leading you to a community. So when you search for something like that, we show your searches, but we also include a help module that will redirect you to an NGO partner that engages in these kind of off-ramping programming options. So that is one of many other examples. We partner up with the UNDP for a program called Extreme Lives, which is a series of videos of individuals that have been a part of this world and have now become formers So that's another example within the Facebook spectrum. But again, this is Facebook and our platform looks a certain way. So another thing to flag for this question is not all platforms are the same. Some are encrypted messaging platforms. Some are social media platforms. We've also got just document saving platforms. So what does it actually look like? That's another discussion to have. I think I've given you more questions than I have answers, but welcome to my world.
I'll just really quickly jump in and say, look, I'm very much in favor of getting out of this false binary of take down, leave up content as the only way that we deal with content moderation. That has sort of prevailed for too long, and we are seeing platforms embrace that a lot more in the last couple of years, and even in the last couple of months, a lot more than we used to. And I'm excited about that, and I'm excited about experimentation. But here's my caveat, Debbie Downer yet again. We need more transparency around what works and what the results of those are. So very often those interventions sound really intuitive and they sound really good, but we actually don't know what works. Like, we don't know, for example, when we attach a label to something and we give the platforms a round of applause for saying, yes, you've attached a label, you've attached a redirecting. We have no idea how many people click on that. And does it actually work, or does everyone just go, oh, cool, thank you very much, now show me the content? And stuff like that. Like, I mean, we suspect that it might not, but maybe it attracts more attention. And there have been some counterintuitive findings in various areas around flagging misinformation and disinformation that suggest that we can't just trust our gut about what we think works here, but we need to have independent and accountable research and transparency around that, and to make sure that the interventions don't just sort of feel good, but are actually working. So I'm really excited about that, but I also think that we need to have much more sort of auditing of the results.
Wonderful. I'm looking at the clock at the moment, and unfortunately we're about to hit the hour mark. While there are a ton of very excellent questions in the Q&A function that I would love to pose to our panelists, I don't want to take too much of their time. I know a round of applause, which we traditionally do at the end of events, will be somewhat a little silent in this virtual format, but I'd really like to thank the panelists once again for agreeing to participate in what's been a fantastic discussion. Thanks to all of you again for coming out. I'm sure we'll